The sword stood in the heart of the ruined temple, half buried in stone, glowing faintly like a dying ember. No one knew when it had first appeared, but the old scrolls said it had been there for thousands of years. Aliens from every corner of the empire had tried to lift it. Great warriors, priests, kings, and even strange beasts were brought to the temple. Each one had failed. The sword did not move. The stone around it remained solid, as if fused by some force stronger than time itself. Stories grew around it. Some said the sword belonged to the gods, dropped during a battle in the heavens. Some believed it held the power to unite all worlds. Others whispered that it carried a curse, one so strong it would destroy whoever dared to take it. Children grew up hearing these tales, and adults lived their entire lives knowing the sword would never be theirs. Yet still, they came. Each year, more and more challengers touched the hilt, hoping to be chosen. Each year, they left with shame and failure in their hearts. The temple itself became silent with time. Broken pillars leaned in the dust, and vines crept over the cracked walls. Still, the sword remained untouched, glowing faintly in the shadows. Its light was not bright, but it was steady, a reminder that something beyond understanding lived inside the blade. Even the priests who guarded the place no longer believed anyone could claim it. They kept the temple only to honor the past. One evening, a crowd gathered once again. A festival had been declared, and warriors from many alien clans came to prove themselves. They walked up the worn steps of the temple, one after another, their armor shining, their faces proud. The first warrior placed his heavy hands on the hilt and pulled with all his strength. His arms shook, his veins swelled, his teeth clenched until blood filled his mouth. The sword did not move even an inch. The crowd laughed at him when he collapsed. The next warrior stepped forward, larger and stronger, his muscles thick like ropes. He roared as he pulled, shaking the ground beneath him. The sword stood still, mocking him. He fell on his knees, defeated. Dozens tried, but all failed. The stone seemed harder than steel, the hilt colder than ice. Some cried out in frustration, some broke their own bones in the attempt, and some walked away in silence, never looking back. The crowd grew restless, whispering the same words that had been whispered for centuries. No one will ever lift it. Yet still, the sword remained. Its faint glow pulsed, almost as if it was alive, watching the ones who tried, rejecting them all. It had waited for ages, but no one understood what it was waiting for. Far at the back of the temple, a stranger stood. He was not like the others. His skin was pale compared to the shining scales of the aliens. His clothes were plain, worn from travel. His eyes looked tired, but there was something calm in his face. He was a human, one of the few scattered across the stars, often ignored, sometimes mocked. To the aliens, he was weak, fragile, unworthy of attention. He had no armor, no glowing weapons, no crest of honor. He stood silently as the others struggled, his hands in his pockets, only watching. The priests noticed him, but said nothing. The crowd glanced his way and then turned back to the warriors. What could a human do that mighty aliens could not? He was nothing but an outsider, a shadow in the temple. Still, the human felt something different. As his eyes rested on the sword, he felt a pull in his chest, as if the blade was looking back at him. A faint whisper moved through his mind, though no one else seemed to hear it. It was not a voice with words, but a call. A sensation, like a heartbeat echoing in his bones. The more he looked at the sword, the stronger it became. He wondered if the others had ever felt it. Judging by their angry, broken faces, he knew they had not. The night stretched on, the torches flickering against the temple walls. One last warrior, a champion from the northern clans, stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, his horns sharp, his armor marked with victories. He lifted the hilt with both hands and screamed as he pulled. His scream turned into a roar that shook the temple. The ground cracked beneath him, dust falling from the ceiling. But the sword stood still, unbroken, unyielding. At last, even the champion fell to his knees, beaten. The crowd groaned with disappointment. Some shouted that the festival was a waste. Others demanded the priests explain why the sword mocked them again. The priests bowed their heads, giving no answer. And then, in the silence that followed, the human stepped forward. He did not walk with pride, nor with fear. His steps were slow, almost uncertain, yet each one echoed in the temple like a drumbeat. The crowd turned to watch, first with confusion, then with laughter. "What is this?" one alien shouted. "A human dares?" Another sneered. "He will break his fragile bones," a third laughed. The priests frowned, but none stopped him. The human reached the stone, tapped where the sword glowed faintly, waiting. For centuries, it had rejected kings, warriors, and champions. Now, as the human's hand moved closer, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the temple itself was holding its breath. The human's fingers brushed the hilt, and in that instant, the faint glow flared bright, filling the temple with blinding light. The stone trembled, the crowd gasped. For the first time in living memory, the sword responded. The forgotten blade had found someone. And it was not an alien, it was the human. The news of the human touching the sword spread like fire. The crowd that had laughed only moments before now stood frozen, their mouths open, their eyes wide. Some backed away, afraid, while others pushed forward to see with their own eyes. The light around the sword dimmed slowly, but did not vanish. It pulsed softly, like a heart, as if it had awakened from a long sleep. The human's hand still rested on the hilt. He had not even tried to pull it yet, but already the impossible had happened. The sword had accepted his touch. The priests whispered to each other in panic. They searched their old scrolls, their voices shaking, their faces pale. For generations, they had believed that only one of their own kind, a chosen alien, would ever claim the blade. Humans were never mentioned in the prophecy, not even once. To them, this was wrong, unnatural, almost insulting. Some priests wanted to stop the human, to order him away before the shame grew worse. But fear held them back. The sword itself seemed to be guarding him now. The warriors who had tried and failed looked at him with hatred. Their pride had been crushed by an outsider. They had trained their whole lives, carried scars of 100 battles, but none of that mattered now. The sword had ignored their strength, their honor, their bloodlines. It had given even a flicker of power to a human, someone they believed weaker than the smallest of their children. Their hands tightened on their weapons, their teeth ground together, but none dared to strike. They too could feel the strange energy in the air, warning them that to harm the human now might bring doom. The human himself felt strange, almost lost. He did not understand why the sword reacted to him. He had never sought power, never asked for glory. To him, it was only a legend, a story he had heard in his travels. Yet when he touched it, he felt warmth rushing through his veins, as if the sword recognized him. His heart pounded, his hand trembled, but he could not let go. The sword was not heavy. It felt alive, like it was breathing with him. The high priest stepped forward at last. His voice was deep, commanding silence from the crowd. He declared that the trials must continue. No prophecy would be decided by one touch. The human had not lifted the sword yet. He had only touched it. Perhaps, the priest said, it was only a trick of fate, a moment of false hope. The sword had rejected thousands before, and surely it would reject him too. The crowd shouted in agreement. Some demanded the human be forced to try and lift it, so all could see him fail. Others cursed loudly, saying the sword mocked them by glowing at his touch. The temple grew loud, filled with anger, confusion, and fear. The human, still standing before the sword, looked around at the faces twisted with hatred. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, but deep inside, a calm voice told him to stay. The sword had called him. He could not walk away now. He nodded slowly, and without another word, he tightened his grip on the hilt. The air grew colder, the ground trembled again. The human pulled lightly, almost testing, and the stone cracked under the sword's base. A loud gasp filled the temple. The blade shifted, not much, not free, but enough for everyone to see it move. For the first time in centuries, the sword had obeyed someone's hand. Chaos erupted, warriors shouted angrily, priests argued with each other. Some cried that the human was chosen, others swore he was cursed. The crowd split in two, those who believed and those who hated. The human himself let go quickly, stepping back in shock. He had not even used his full strength, yet the blade had stirred. The high priest raised his staff, demanding silence. He declared that the trials were not finished. The sword must be tested again, but this time under the rules of the ancient rite. Each challenger would approach in order, but the human would be the last. If the sword truly accepted him, it would not only move but rise fully from the stone. Only then would the truth be known. The warriors agreed, though their eyes burned with rage. They were determined to prove themselves and humiliate the human in the end. The priests began preparing the ritual, marking symbols around the sword with glowing dust, chanting words that echoed through the temple. The air grew heavy with strange energy, and even the bravest of the crowd felt a shiver run down their spines. One by one, the warriors tried again. They placed their hands on the hilt, pulled with all their strength, screamed, begged, roared, and fought against the unyielding blade. Nothing happened. Not a spark of light, not a crack of stone. The sword ignored them all. Each failure made the crowd more restless, more bitter, more afraid of the truth that was forming before their eyes. Finally, it was the human's turn. He stepped forward slowly, feeling every stare burn into his skin. His heart pounded, his palms were sweaty, but he forced himself to breathe. He reached out again, his fingers brushing the hilt, and once more, the glow spread across the blade. The symbols drawn by the priests lit up, shining like fire across the temple floor. The chants stopped. Silence fell. The human gripped the sword with both hands and pulled. The stone cracked louder than before, a sharp sound that echoed in the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling. The sword rose an inch higher, glowing brighter, fighting against the chains of time that bound it. The crowd gasped, unable to deny what they saw. The sword was answering him, and only him. But just as he tried again, a sudden roar shook the temple. One of the warriors, furious at the sight, charged at the human with his weapon raised. Others followed, driven mad by pride and fear. The trials had turned into chaos. The human stood frozen, the glowing sword still in his hands, as the first blade swung toward him. The warrior's blade came down with a roar, but the human moved without thinking. His hands pulled harder on the ancient sword, and with a crack like thunder, the blade tore free from the stone. Light burst out, blinding the attackers for a moment. The sword hummed in his hands, alive, heavy yet weightless at the same time. The warrior's strike never landed. The glowing edge of the sword blocked it on its own, moving faster than the human's eyes could follow. Sparks flew as metal clashed against something far older and far stronger. The crowd screamed in shock. For centuries, no one had lifted the blade. Now a human held it high, its light dancing across the broken temple. Some fell to their knees, crying that the prophecy had come true. Others shouted curses, refusing to believe what they saw. The priests stumbled back, their voices trembling as they tried to understand the ancient words they had sworn to guard. The warrior who attacked him staggered away, his weapon bent, his face pale. His pride was shattered, but rage burned in his chest. He charged again, but the sword moved with ease in the human's hands. A single swing of the glowing blade cut through the warrior's armor like paper. The alien fell, not dead but defeated, his blood spilling on the cracked floor. Silence followed for a heartbeat, and then chaos exploded. Dozens of warriors rushed forward, their honor demanding they destroy the outsider who had done what none of them could. The human did not even know how to fight with a sword, yet the weapon guided him. It pulled his arms, shifted his stance, swung at the perfect moment. He felt his body move like it was no longer his own. Blades clashed, spears struck, claws slashed, but the sword deflected them all. Every swing of the glowing edge knocked enemies back, cutting through shields and armor with ease. The more he fought, the more the sword seemed to grow stronger, its light spreading brighter and brighter until the whole temple glowed like day. The crowd could not believe what they saw. Some shouted that he was chosen by the gods. Others screamed that he was a thief of destiny. Mothers covered their children's eyes, while warriors cried in fury. The priests watched in silence, their faces pale as ash. They had spent lifetimes teaching that only their kind could wield the blade, yet here was a human standing unbroken against all odds. The human himself was terrified. His heart pounded, his arms shook, yet the sword steadied him. Every time he thought he would fall, the weapon pulled him back to his feet. Every time fear froze his chest, the sword's warmth spread through him like fire. He had never been a soldier, never trained for battle, yet now he fought like one. The sword wanted him to survive, and it refused to let him fail. One of the alien champions, larger than the rest, leapt forward with a roar. His massive hammer came down with the force of a mountain. The human raised the sword without thinking, and the glowing blade sliced straight through the hammer's shaft. The champion fell to the ground, staring at his broken weapon with disbelief. The crowd gasped, the sound echoing through the temple like thunder. Still, the warriors came, but their numbers began to thin. Fear crept into their eyes. They had thought the human would be weak, fragile, a joke to be crushed quickly. But now, one by one, they were falling. Not dead, but defeated, their weapons broken, their pride shattered. None could stand against the sword, not even for a moment. The human, breathing hard, stood in the center of the chaos, the glowing blade steady in his grip. Then, all at once, the priests shouted for silence. Their voices boomed, echoing like thunder through the temple halls. The warriors froze, their rage halted by the weight of the command. The high priest stepped forward, his staff glowing with ancient runes. His eyes locked on the human, not with hatred but with fear. He spoke of the prophecy, the words carved in stone long ago. The blade shall sleep until the one it chooses awakens it, and that one shall decide the fate of worlds. The crowd fell silent. The words were known, but never taken seriously. They were old, forgotten, turned into legend. Now before their eyes, the legend had come alive. And the chosen was not one of them. It was a human. The warriors backed away slowly, their faces filled with shame and anger. Some still glared at the human, ready to strike if given the order. But the priests' voices held them back. None dared defy the prophecy now that they had seen it with their own eyes. The human lowered the sword slightly, his arms aching, his breath ragged. He looked at the glowing blade, still humming softly in his grip, and whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "Why me?" The sword gave no answer, only glowed brighter, as if satisfied it had found its master. The high priest raised his staff and declared that the trials were over. The sword had chosen, and its choice could not be denied. Some in the crowd bowed their heads, weeping. Others stormed out of the temple, swearing never to accept this fate. The warriors dragged their wounded away, their pride crushed, their hatred burning deeper. The human stood alone at the center, the weight of thousands of eyes on him. He had not asked for this. He had not wanted it. Yet the sword was his now, and with it came a destiny he could not escape. The temple walls seemed to close in around him, the whispers of the crowd echoing like ghosts. Some called him savior, others called him curse. He himself felt like neither. But deep within the sword, a power pulsed waiting. It had slept for centuries, and now it was awake. And every alien in the temple knew one truth they could not change. Their fate was no longer theirs to decide. It was in the hands of a human. The silence after the priest's words did not last long. Whispers spread quickly, turning into angry voices. Some aliens shouted that the prophecy was a lie, twisted by chance. Others demanded the human be killed at once before more shame fell on their people. The sound of thousands of voices filled the temple, echoing off the stone walls like a storm. The human stood in the middle, the sword still glowing in his hand, feeling their hatred pressing down on him. He had not asked for this power, but now he could not escape it. The warriors who had failed the trials clenched their fists and growled. Their honor had been destroyed, and the sight of the human holding the sword was like a blade cutting into their pride. One stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage, calling the human a thief who had stolen the god's gift. Others joined, raising their weapons, demanding the priests order the human's execution. But the priests themselves looked torn. Some bowed their heads, unable to deny what they had seen. Others shouted that this was blasphemy, that no alien bloodline would ever be ruled by an outsider, let alone a fragile human. The high priest lifted his staff again, but his voice was softer this time. He reminded them of the ancient words, words older than their empire itself. The sword chose, and its choice could not be undone. Still, his eyes betrayed fear. He did not want to believe what the prophecy had revealed. The human's chest tightened as he listened to them argue about his life, his worth, his fate. He wanted to shout that he never wanted their sword, their prophecy, or their war. But when he looked down at the blade, glowing in his grip, he felt its warmth again. It did not let him speak. It held him steady, as if telling him to remain silent. The sword had chosen, and that truth was louder than any words he could say. A sudden roar broke through the temple. One of the alien warlords, covered in scars and armor, pushed through the crowd. His eyes burned with fury, his sharp teeth bared in rage. He pointed at the human and declared him a fraud. He swore before everyone that this outsider would never rule over their kind. His words struck like fire, and the crowd cheered with him. The hatred grew louder, stronger, boiling over. The warlord demanded combat. If the sword truly belonged to the human, let him prove it in battle. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices shaking the ruined ceiling. The priests did not stop it. Perhaps they wanted to see if the sword had made a mistake, or perhaps they wanted the human destroyed. Either way, the challenge was set. The human was to fight for his life. The warlord stepped into the center, his armor glinting, his weapon a giant axe that had crushed countless enemies before. He towered over the human, his muscles like stone, his breath heavy with fury. The human's hands trembled, but the sword pulsed again, steadying him. He raised it slowly, its glow cutting through the shadows of the temple. The battle began with a roar. The warlord swung his axe, each strike shaking the ground like thunder. The human barely managed to block, the sword guiding his hands in perfect movements. Sparks flew with every clash, the sound deafening. The crowd screamed with excitement, their anger mixing with awe as the human stood against the unstoppable force of their champion. The warlord fought with skill and power, each strike meant to crush. But the sword answered with light, moving faster than the human could think, almost as if it was fighting on its own. The human felt the weight of the battle pressing on his chest, sweat running down his face, but he did not fall. His arms ached, his body shook, but the blade refused to let him break. At last, the warlord raised his axe for a final strike, roaring so loud the walls shook. The human's body moved before his mind could catch up. The glowing sword swung upward, meeting the axe head-on. A flash of light filled the temple, blinding everyone. The sound of shattering metal echoed like a scream. When the light faded, the warlord's axe lay broken in two pieces on the ground. The sword glowed brighter than ever, humming in the silence. The warlord fell to his knees, stunned, defeated, his pride shattered. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Some cheered, unable to deny the truth anymore. Others shouted in fury, swearing this was witchcraft. The priests stood frozen, their ancient scrolls trembling in their hands. The prophecy had been tested, and the human had not failed. The human lowered the sword, his breath ragged, his arms heavy as stone. He looked around at the sea of alien faces, some filled with fear, some with hatred, some with awe. He felt none of their pride, none of their hunger for power. He only felt the weight of the sword in his hand and the shadow of the prophecy pressing down on him. He wanted to run, to leave, but he knew he could not. The high priest finally spoke again, his voice trembling. He declared that the sword had spoken and its judgment was final. The human was chosen. Whether the people accepted it or not, destiny had already begun. His words silenced the crowd for a moment, but the hatred did not vanish. Many eyes still glared at the human, filled with thoughts of rebellion and blood. As the temple emptied, whispers spread through the city. Some said a savior had come. Others swore a curse had been born. And in the center of it all, the human stood with the sword, knowing that no matter what he wanted, his life was no longer his own. The prophecy had made him a symbol, and symbols could not escape the fate carved into them. The night was heavy with silence after the battle. The temple that once echoed with chants and roars now felt empty, though thousands had stood there only hours ago. The human sat near the cracked stone where the sword had once rested, the blade still glowing faintly in his hands. His breath came slow, his body aching with every movement. He had survived the fight, but survival did not feel like victory. The eyes of the aliens, filled with rage and fear, still haunted him. He knew they would not let this go. Outside the temple walls, the city buzzed with unrest. Some alien clans shouted in the streets that the prophecy was fulfilled and the human must be obeyed. Others marched with weapons, calling for his death. Fires burned in the distance, set by angry mobs who refused to accept a human as chosen. The empire was splitting apart, tribe against tribe, faith against faith. The sword had not united them. It had cracked them open like dry earth in a storm. Inside the temple, the priests argued among themselves. Some believed their duty was to protect the human at all costs, since the prophecy demanded it. Others wanted to hand him over to the warlords before more blood was spilled. Their voices rose and fell like waves crashing against each other, but none dared approach the human directly. The glow of the sword kept them at a distance, as if it warned them that any harm toward its bearer would bring destruction. The human sat in silence, staring at the blade. His reflection shimmered on its surface, but it did not look his own face. His eyes looked sharper. His skin glowed faintly with the same light as the sword. It frightened him. He whispered to himself that he was no warrior, no leader, only a wanderer who had walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. But the sword pulsed in his grip, answering his fear with warmth, as if telling him that there was no mistake. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. A group of warriors stormed the temple, their armor clanking, their weapons raised. They were not here for trials or honor. They had come to kill him. Their leader shouted that the prophecy was a lie, that the sword's light was a trick. He swore that if the human died, the sword would return to silence, and all would be as before. The human stood slowly, his body weak, but his grip on the sword firm. The glow brightened, filling the temple once more. The warriors charged, their footsteps shaking the ground. The human raised the sword without thinking, and it moved with him like a living creature. A wave of light burst out, striking the attackers with a force that sent them crashing against the walls. Their weapons shattered, their armor cracked, and they lay on the floor groaning in pain. None of them were dead, but none could rise again. The human looked at his hands, trembling in shock. He had not swung the sword. He had not even struck them. The blade itself had acted as if protecting him. The priests gasped, their faces pale. They had seen power like this only in stories. It was not the strength of a man, but of something far older. The whispers grew louder. Some fell to their knees in worship. Others fled in terror. The noise reached the city outside. More crowds gathered, their torches lighting the streets. Some chanted the human's name, though he had never told them who he was. Others screamed that he was a curse who would bring ruin to their people. Fights broke out in the streets, blood spilling between neighbors who once lived in peace. The empire was tearing itself apart, all because the sword had chosen a human. The high priest came to the human at last, his face heavy with fear and sorrow. He told him that the prophecy spoke of more than just the chosen. It spoke of a war that would follow, a great trial that would decide not only the fate of their empire, but of all worlds touched by the stars. The priest admitted he had hidden this part of the prophecy, fearing what it meant. But now there was no turning away. The sword had awakened, and with it, destiny itself. The human listened, his heart sinking. He did not want to be part of their war. He did not want to lead anyone. But the priest's eyes told him the truth. He no longer had a choice. The blade would not let him walk away. The prophecy had tied him to their fate, and if he tried to run, the whole world might burn. That night, as fires lit the sky and voices of rage filled the city, the human walked to the highest point of the temple. The sword glowed at his side, casting light across the broken land. Below him, the aliens stared up, their faces a mix of hope, fear, and hatred. He raised the sword into the air, and its glow spread across the city like dawn breaking through night. For a moment, silence fell. The people stared, their arguments forgotten, their breaths caught in their throats. But then, from the shadows, a horn sounded. The armies of the warlords were marching toward the temple, their banners flying, their weapons gleaming. They would not accept him. They would not bow to the prophecy. They came to end it with blood. The human lowered the sword slowly, his eyes narrowing. He had never wanted this battle, but now it was coming for him. The blade pulsed in his hand, eager, waiting. The fate of the empire was about to be decided, and the human stood at the center of it all. The battlefield still smoked from the clash. Broken weapons lay scattered, and the ground was split where the human and the warlord had struck with their blades. Dust hung in the air, covering the silence that followed. The human stood in the center, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, the sword glowing in his hand like a flame that refused to die. All around him, thousands of alien eyes stared. Some were filled with fear, some with awe, and many with hatred. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The defeated warlord knelt, his broken axe beside him. His eyes burned with pride and shame, but he could not deny what had happened. The sword had chosen the human, and the human had beaten him. For one long moment, he looked as if he would rise again and strike, but the glow of the blade kept him on his knees. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his head, admitting defeat without words. The armies behind him murmured in shock. Some dropped their weapons, unable to fight against what they had just witnessed. Others shouted angrily, swearing they would never bow to an outsider. The camp split in seconds, soldiers turning against each other, unsure whether to surrender or fight on. The empire was breaking, right before everyone's eyes. The priests stepped forward, their robes torn and their faces pale. They raised their staffs and tried to calm the crowd. They spoke of the prophecy again, reminding everyone that the choice was no longer theirs to make. The sword had awakened, and its master was clear. But their voices were drowned by the shouts of rebellion. Not all believed, and not all would accept. The human looked down at the blade. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His body screamed for rest, yet the sword pulsed warmly in his grip, keeping him on his feet. He had never wanted this. He was not a king, not a warrior, not a savior. Yet now, thousands of lives hung on his shoulders. He felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him. The warlord who had been defeated struggled to stand. His voice, rough and broken, rose above the noise. He declared that though he had lost, the fight was not over. He swore that more armies would come, that more blood would be spilled. He promised that the human would never sit on their throne, even if the gods themselves had chosen him. His words spread like poison, stirring the soldiers still loyal to him. Swords lifted again, shields raised, and once more the battlefield shook with the sound of war. The human raised the sword high, and the light exploded outward. A wave of energy burst across the field, throwing back those who charged. It was not a strike of death, but of warning. The ground split wider, flames shot from the cracks, and the air hummed with power. The soldiers froze, staring at the glowing figure in the center of the storm. The sword's hum grew louder, almost like a voice whispering to them all. For a moment, the noise of battle died, replaced by silence filled with fear. The human's voice carried through the silence, steady and clear. He told them he had not asked for this power, nor did he want their throne. But the sword had chosen, and its choice was stronger than their hate. If they wanted to fight, they could. But if they did, they would not fight him alone. They would fight the will of the blade and the prophecy itself. His words rang across the field, and even those who hated him felt their knees weaken. A group of alien clans stepped forward, kneeling one by one. They laid their weapons on the ground, their voices trembling as they swore loyalty to the chosen. Their surrender lit a spark among others. More clans followed, some in fear, some in hope, until a large part of the army had lowered their heads. Yet still, pockets of resistance remained, their eyes burning with rage, unwilling to bow. The high priest lifted his staff and shouted that the prophecy was unfolding as it should. He declared that this was the beginning, not the end. The human's rise would bring great trials, and the fate of worlds would be decided in blood and fire. His words did not calm the rebels, but they gave strength to those who believed. The temple bells rang in the distance, their echoes mixing with the cries of the soldiers. The human felt the weight of every kneeling warrior, every bowed head, every eye filled with hope and hate. The sword pulsed again, stronger than before, as if feeding on their surrender. Its light wrapped around him, making him shine brighter, almost otherworldly. For the first time, he felt something deep in his chest, a bond between him and the weapon. It was not just power. It was destiny, written long before he was born. But he also felt danger. The rebels who still stood were not finished. They would not stop until his blood stained the ground. Their whispers promised war beyond this battlefield, war that would spread across worlds. The human knew that this was only the beginning. The prophecy had awakened more than the sword. It had awakened enemies he did not yet understand. Night fell, but the glow of the sword did not fade. The human remained at the center of the battlefield, a figure caught between worship and hatred. Around him, the empire was breaking, choosing sides, tearing itself apart. Above him, the stars shone cold and distant, as if watching the story unfold. And deep within, the sword hummed like a heartbeat, whispering that the true trial had not even begun. The night sky glowed red from the fires of the broken city. Smoke rose into the stars, carrying with it the cries of the wounded and the whispers of rebellion. The temple that had once stood as a place of worship now looked like a fortress under siege. Walls cracked, banners torn, and blood staining the stones where countless warriors had fallen. The human stood at the center, the sword still glowing faintly in his grip, its hum steady like the beat of a heart. Around him, silence had settled, But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. The clans that had knelt now looked to him as their leader. Their voices trembled with loyalty, their eyes filled with both fear and hope. They believed the prophecy was real. They believed the sword had chosen him for a reason. Yet the rebels in the shadows, those who still carried rage in their hearts, whispered of betrayal. They promised that they would never accept a human as the chosen one. Their plots spread like poison in the night, feeding the fire of war that had only just begun. The human felt their eyes on him, even as he tried to rest. He had not slept since the moment the sword left the stone. His body was heavy, his mind clouded, yet the weapon refused to let him fall. It filled him with strength when he had none. It lifted him when his knees bent. It carried him forward, forcing him into the role of leader whether he wanted it or not. He whispered into the silence that he was no savior, no king, no prophet. But the sword glowed in reply, steady and unyielding. It did not care for his doubts. It had chosen. The high priest approached him in the quiet hours, his face pale, his hands shaking as he clutched the ancient scrolls. He told the human of the final lines of the prophecy, words even he had feared to speak aloud. The prophecy said that once the chosen raised the sword, the fate of all worlds would fall into his hands. Either he would unite them, or he would burn them in endless war. There was no middle path. The weight of those words pressed heavy on the human's chest. He did not want either destiny, yet the sword gave him no choice. At dawn, the horns of war sounded again. The rebels had gathered their armies, more numerous than before, driven by pride and rage. They marched on the temple, their weapons gleaming in the pale light of morning. Their voices roared, demanding the human's head, promising that his death would end the curse. The loyal clans rushed to defend him, forming lines of shields and spears, their voices chanting his name. The battlefield was ready, the ground trembling under the steps of thousands. The human stepped forward, the sword glowing brighter with each heartbeat. The armies grew silent, waiting. His voice carried over the field, not loud but steady. He told them he had never asked for this, but he would not run from it. He said he would not be their king, nor their slave. He would be what the sword had made him, its bearer, its chosen, its voice. The rebels laughed, shouting that no human could carry such a burden. But their laughter ended when the sword's glow burst into the sky, brighter than the sun. The battle began. Clashes of steel, screams of war, the ground shaking with every strike. The human fought at the front, the sword cutting through armor and shield as if they were air. It moved with him, faster than thought, stronger than muscle. His enemies fell, one after another, unable to stand against the light. The loyal clans followed, their courage burning brighter as they saw him fight. The rebels pushed harder, but every strike against him was turned aside. The battle raged for hours, neither side yielding. Blood stained the earth, cries filled the sky. The human's arms ached, his body felt like it would collapse, but the sword refused to let him fall. With every strike, it poured strength into him, keeping him on his feet. He realized with a shiver that he was no longer fighting alone. The sword was alive, fighting with him, guiding him, leading him to victory. At last, he stood face to face with the rebel leaders. They were fierce, their eyes burning with hatred, their weapons sharp and deadly. They circled him, 3 against 1, believing his body would finally break. But the sword flared with light, filling the battlefield with a glow so blinding that even the sun seemed dim. The human moved like a storm, his strikes faster than lightning, his blade unstoppable. One by one, the rebel leaders fell, their weapons shattering, their bodies broken. The rebels watched in horror as their champions were defeated. Their voices faltered, their courage broke. Slowly, weapons dropped, shields lowered, and thousands fell to their knees. The battlefield grew silent once more, the only sound the steady hum of the sword. The war was over. The prophecy had spoken its final truth. The human stood among the fallen, the sword glowing in his hands, but there was no joy in his heart. He had won, but the cost was everywhere around him. Blood, ash, broken lives. The aliens bowed their heads, calling him savior, but he did not feel like one. He felt only the weight of what was to come. The sword pulsed softly, almost as if whispering that this was only the beginning. As the sun set, the high priest approached, his voice trembling. He declared that the age of the human had begun. The clans bowed low, their voices chanting the Chosen's name. The human raised the sword high, its light shining into the darkening sky. He did not smile. He did not speak. For he knew the truth the others could not see. He was not the master of the blade. He was its servant. And the fate of worlds was no longer in their hands. It was in his.